a few connections to the previous speech because I'm working with nodes. As these nodes I'm working with are states, but also cities seen as areas for foraging, conscription, looting, and other state-like behavior. As a political scientist, I like to asterisk sociology terms like solidarity and affiliation. I was immediately reminded of a brilliant statue that was done of the successors to Diocletian, Emperor of Rome, who decided he would set up a system with 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars so that each would rule an area and they would all have solidarity together. And the sculptor was sufficiently brilliant that he could actually have done Ozymandias and done him well. Because you look at those sculptures, number one, they are solid. They are bound to one another. And 2, it looks as if they're all trying to murder one another. And both of those statements were true. So solidarity and affiliation have a different sense. And they're going to have a different sense in the way that I speak. Because I'm dealing now with the practical question of systemness. The title of the paper is When States Systems Unite, Spatio-Temporal Boundary and Transition Issues in the Unification of the Central, Far Eastern, and Indic States Systems. No, globalization and the United Nations say, all right, all the states of the world today, except maybe Taiwan and non-states like Somalia, are all somehow or other strongly linked politically. There was a time, however, when there were systems of states, but when there was no global system of states. And the question is, when and how did we move from these separate state systems to the single global system that we have today? Of approaching this, I have to use several versions of terminology. I sometimes speak of state systems because they are systems of power orders. Sometimes civilizations, because these are also networks of cities. Now we're looking there at the nodes. They are also politico-military networks, because we're now speaking of the character of the relations that bind them together. And they're world systems because they have definable overall power structures and they have boundaries, even though the current one has the boundary of the Earth's surface. Now there are different ways of trying to measure these changes. One is to look at these systems in their aspect as city networks and ask, when do the various city networks that spring up on the world here and there become one? When do the cities approach one another so that movement between them movement between those which were formerly in different systems becomes as easy as movement within. This, again, I think relates directly to some of the terminology of the previous presentation. However, I take the approach of looking at the entities in their aspect of state systems, and I look for transactional phenomena to assess them for political type intensity, duration, and magnitude. Incidentally, looking for political boundaries is quite different from looking for economic boundaries, is quite different from looking at cultural boundaries. All of these are entirely legitimate, but at any moment in world history, if you'd ask, all right, where is cultural homogeneity, you would say, well, it isn't the same as where the political states are, and usually, until the last century or the century before, economies outran the polities. The flag followed trade, as it were, because it was worthwhile doing so. All right, so I'm doing the politics here today, and only the politics. How do you decide? Well, one way of asking when 2 becomes 1 is to ask, all right, what kind of transactions, political transactions, take place between members of things which we recognize as state systems? And I use the 2 sets of benchmarks. Number 1, Rome and Persia. For this meaning Rome plus Byzantium and Parthia plus Persia, 66 BC to AD 628. What did they do to one another? Well, in Appendix 1 of this, I summarized their interchanges. In those years, they fought 21 wars. They allied once against some miserable victim between. No, they had 17 treaties, including one eternal peace. It lasted 9 years. And one 50 years peace that lasted 10. All right, so they were approximating what they were able to do. On 4 occasions, they intervened in one another's civil wars, and on 4 occasions, they set up clientelistic relations in which somebody did something for the benefit of actually putting up a client in the other. Okay, and so important political transactions, war-making and peacemaking, conquest and redress, hierarchy and equality, extortion and exchange, demands and concessions, negotiations and snubs, demarcations and redemarcations. And this seems to me to be this is so clearly an enduring and genuine political relationship that it could be treated as a paradigm or archetype against which we could start measuring the connections, sometimes brief, sometimes sporadic, sometimes less intense, between states that we're wondering about in different systems, or whether in different systems or had they become one. All right, that's good for bipolar relations. For multipolar relations, I took the Eastern Zhou area, both in its spring and autumn subperiod and the Warring States subperiod. Nominally, this was an empire under the Zhou dynasty. In fact, as has long been established, it was a multi-state system and interstate and more states than the usually bipolar pair of Rome and Persia. And so we see more complex forms of relations there. And I have an appendix to which summarizes the chief systemic political phenomena: leagues of states leaguing against one another, wars between alliances, balancing behavior in which states allied against a rising power, bandwagoning behavior in which states line up under a rising power, and broad-based conferencing, including a League of Nations that said, no, we don't want to fight anymore. And it actually did succeed for longer than Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations. But it passed. Nonetheless, this is the kind of phenomenon that you want to see. And so we could say Wilson emulated Eastern Zhou. Not as successfully as his predecessor, poor fellow. But you'll find the treatment of this actually in the Requeduco done by a Japanese fan of international organization who wanted to point out that it had been done before and better, and he was right. All right, now again, we have here a benchmark for strong relations within a multi-state system. All right, so then we have a practical problem. We're measuring Eurasian political globalization. As of 1500 BC, I would say there are 3 state systems in the Eurasian belt of cities and states that runs from East Asia and South Asia through the so-called Middle East and into the Mediterranean periphery. Okay, when did all these become one, and what went on in the interstices? Each of these, as I use 2 labels for, because one of the reasons, well, the basic reason why there wasn't a smooth integration of these is what we call the Central Asian Barrier, which is a bunch of high mountains, cold, with deserts in between, not very many people to conscript or loot or steal the, or do whatever armies do when they march between. Tian Shan, Himalayas, Hindu Kush, Pamirs obstruct movement. They don't totally obstruct it. This is a semi-permeable barrier. Proselytizers, pilgrims, and traders of preciosities get through, and envoys get through more easily than conquerors and armies, which have to be supported on the way unless you have built the Persian system of royal roads or a grand canal, neither of which got through the Central Asian barrier, and they're still trying to do it. They got round it eventually with the development of better naval technology, but there was a long time when they were poking at the barrier or getting somewhat through and then deciding, no, we are not going to do this anymore. All right, there are other elements, but one must move along. if we look at the periods we're talking about, we have, I think, the ability to assess these state systems from 1500 BC for what I call now, because I'm talking about the barrier, I speak of them as west side, east side, and south side, because that's their relationship and what they were trying to get over. All right, I would estimate there are something like 5,500 pair years of relations between these to study. This has to be. No, sorry, 8,000 on the order of. I missed the central Indic relationship there because it's a sort of weak one. But you have to pare them down for initial examination. And so I use a rebuttable presumption for paring down. Power is easiest to project outside the existing boundaries of a state system when that state system itself is in a moment of unipolarity, hegemony, or imperial unity. And it's hardest when it's in a condition of non-polarity or multipolarity. This presumption is based on another. States have limited attention spans, tend to be preoccupied with mere survival, which is more challenged the weaker they are in their own state systems, and therefore the less their ability to go out and project power beyond. On the contrary, the stronger a state is in its system, the more likely it is to engage in ambitious questing. Again, technological developments of sea power and then overland logistics undermine these presumptions after AD 1500. For the pre-modern era, I think they can be retained as principles of case selection. Okay, so the rest of the paper involves a selection of the chief powers of each system, asking, all right, what went on? What went on, for instance, between Cyrus the Great and Zhou Dynasty, East Asia? Well, he got to Fergana, built a city, and went somewhere else. No, or died, because we have 4 accounts of his death. They contradict one another. It was either peaceful or very bloody, but he did not get beyond the barrier. Alexander got to the barrier, destroyed Cyrus' city, created his own nations. Now, there are also entities that for a period bridged, or in some cases seem to have bridged the barrier, and I list a batch of those. And in each case, I've made a beginning. I've made an attempt to get at the interactions and to decide in a preliminary way how long the connections that they established between these west side, east side, and south side systems were, and how close they came to the eventual globalization or Eurasian unification, which did finally occur. What remains as the remittance for me or whoever wants to work on this is get more detail on these interactions and change your mind when necessary.
All right.